What if the sky was not a limit but a battlefield? During the Second World War, it was exactly that. Between 1939 and 1945, thousands of young men climbed into single-seat aircraft, trusting their lives to a roaring engine, a few machine guns, and their own skill. They were fighter pilots, the best of them became aces. An ace was a pilot who had shot down 5 or more enemy aircraft. But what made them legendary? Was it just the numbers, or was it something more? Was it a single impossible fight against overwhelming odds? Was it an act of mercy when none was expected, or was it the sheer brutal efficiency with which they hunted? Like, these are not just stories of machines, they are stories of human beings pushed to the absolute edge of their abilities, where a split-second decision separated life from death. We will look at 17 of these moments. These are the encounters that were whispered about in briefing rooms and written about in after-action reports, the dogfights that became legends. Number 17 was the Thach Weave, the secret to beating the unbeatable. It was June 4th, 1942. The sky over the Pacific Ocean near Midway Atoll was a terrifying place to be. The Imperial Japanese Navy was on the attack. Their primary fighter was the Mitsubishi A6M-0. To American pilots, the Zero seemed like a ghost. It could outturn and outclimb almost anything the U.S. Navy could put in the air. Flying a Grumman F-4F Wildcat against a Zero was often a death sentence. The Wildcat was tough, heavily armed, and had self-sealing fuel tanks, but it was also heavy and slow compared to the nimble Japanese fighter. Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thach of Fighting Squadron 3 knew this problem intimately. He had spent weeks before the battle working on a solution. He would sit at his desk with matchboxes, pushing them around to simulate aircraft in combat. He was trying to figure out how 2 slower, less maneuverable fighters could work together to defeat a superior opponent. What he came up with was revolutionary. He called it the beam defense position, but history would remember it as the Thach Weave. The theory was simple, but its execution required incredible discipline and trust between pilots. 2 Wildcats would fly side by side, about a wingspan apart. When a Zero got on the tail of one Wildcat, the pilot would radio his wingman and make a hard turn towards him. The wingman would then turn hard towards the first plane. Their flight paths would cross. The Zero, focused on its target, would have to follow the first Wildcat through the turn. As it did, it would fly directly into the sights of the second Wildcat. The hunter would become the hunted. On that June morning, Thach got to test his theory in the most brutal laboratory imaginable. He was leading a flight of 6 Wildcats when they were jumped by a swarm of around 20 Zeros. Thach's wingman Ensign Ram Dib immediately got a Zero on his tail. Thach got on the radio. "Okay, Ram, do it now." He banked his Wildcat hard to the left, and Dib banked hard to the right towards him. A Japanese pilot, likely confident in his superior machine, followed Dib. Just as Thach had planned on his desk with matchboxes, the Zero flew right in front of him. Thach squeezed the trigger. His 6.50 caliber machine guns tore into the enemy plane, and it fell away in flames. The fight was a chaotic mess of weaving, turning, and firing. For over 30 minutes, Thach and his pilots repeated the maneuver. They were hopelessly outnumbered, but the weave worked. When a Zero would target one of them, they would turn, cross paths, and present the enemy to their wingman's guns. It was a perfect trap. According to Thach's account in John Lundstrom's book, the 1st Team Pacific Naval Air Combat from Pearl Harbor to Midway, his small flight managed to shoot down at least 3 Zeros, and possibly more, for the loss of 1 Wildcat. The Thach Weave was not just a tactic, it was a psychological breakthrough. It gave American pilots a fighting chance. It proved that teamwork and clever thinking could overcome a technological disadvantage. The tactic was quickly adopted across the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps and became standard procedure. It saved countless American lives and helped turn the tide of the air war in the Pacific. The Zero was no longer a mythical dragon. It was just a machine, and like any machine, it could be beaten. The exact number of Zeros shot down by Thach's flight that day is still debated by historians. Combat claims were often inflated in the heat of battle, but the effectiveness of the tactic was undeniable. It was a moment where strategy born from desperation proved its worth in fire and steel. What if Thach had never developed his weave? How many more American pilots would have been lost in those early, desperate months of the Pacific War? How much of air combat is about the machine, and how much is about the mind of the person flying it? And were there Japanese pilots who survived an encounter with the Thach Weave and reported back on this strange, deadly American tactic? Number 16, could Polish fury change the Battle of Britain? In the summer of 1940, the German Luftwaffe was trying to bomb Great Britain into submission. The Royal Air Force was stretched to its breaking point. Every pilot, every plane was critical, but among the ranks of the RAF were men who were not British. They were pilots from occupied countries like Poland, men who had seen their homes overrun and were burning with a desire for revenge. At first, the British High Command was skeptical. The Polish pilots were experienced, but they spoke little English and were used to different tactics. They were initially sidelined, but as the fighting intensified and British losses mounted, the RAF had no choice. They formed squadrons of foreign pilots. One of these was number 303 Squadron, the Kosciuszko Squadron. It was made up almost entirely of Polish pilots flying Hawker Hurricanes. On August 30th, 1940, 303 Squadron was on a training flight. They were not yet officially operational. Suddenly, they spotted a formation of German bombers. Without waiting for orders from their British commanding officer, several of the Polish pilots peeled off and attacked. One of them, Ludwik Piskiewicz, dived on a Messerschmitt Bf-110 twin-engine fighter and shot it down. The squadron was officially declared operational the very next day. What followed was one of the most remarkable combat records of the entire war. The Polish pilots fought with a ferocity that stunned both their allies and their enemies. They had a different way of fighting. RAF doctrine emphasized disciplined formation attacks. The Poles were aggressive, almost reckless individualists. They believed in getting as close as possible before firing. Their motto could have been no quarter asked, none given. A perfect example of this was on September 7th, 1940. This day marked a shift in the Battle of Britain, as the Luftwaffe began targeting London directly. Over 300 bombers with a heavy fighter escort crossed the channel. 303 Squadron was scrambled to intercept. They tore into the German formations with what witnesses described as controlled rage. They dived head-on into bomber formations, a tactic most pilots avoided. They chased German fighters down to treetop level. In that one day of fighting, the squadron claimed 14 enemy aircraft destroyed, a staggering number for a single unit. And Sergeant Józef František, a Czech pilot flying with the Poles, was a prime example of this aggression. He often broke formation to hunt on his own, a practice that infuriated his commanders but produced incredible results. By the end of September, he had shot down 17 aircraft, becoming one of the top-scoring aces of the entire battle. By the time the Battle of Britain ended in October 1940, 303 Squadron had claimed 126 enemy aircraft destroyed. This was the highest score of any squadron in the entire battle. They achieved this in just 42 days. As detailed in the book 303 Squadron, the legendary Battle of Britain Fighter Squadron by Arkady Fiedler, their success was a combination of experience, desperation, and tactics that the Germans simply were not prepared for. They proved that the man in the cockpit could be more important than the machine. The story of 303 Squadron is a story of underdogs. They were men without a country, fighting for a nation that was not their own, and they became the very best. Their contribution was vital. The RAF was losing pilots faster than they could be trained. The experienced Polish airmen helped plug a critical gap at the most critical time. What if the RAF had never allowed the Polish squadrons to fly? Could the Battle of Britain have been lost? We also have to ask what happened to the detailed German combat reports of their encounters with 303 Squadron. Did they recognize they were fighting a different, more aggressive type of opponent? And how much of the Poles' success was due to a burning desire for revenge? A psychological factor that is impossible to measure. Number 15, how do you fight an enemy you cannot see? The night sky over Europe was a lonely and dangerous place. For the crews of British bombers heading towards German cities, the greatest fear was the Nachtjager, the German night fighter. These were twin-engine planes, often Messerschmitt Bf-110s or Junkers Ju-88s, painted black and equipped with a new secret technology airborne radar. One of the masters of this dark world was Major Heinz Wolfgang Schnaffer. He became the highest-scoring night fighter ace in history, with 121 confirmed victories, almost all of them British four-engine bombers. His story is not one of classic swirling dogfights in the sun. It is a story of patient, methodical hunting in the dark, a deadly game of cat and mouse played out with electronic pulses and cannon shells. A typical mission for Schnaufer and his crew took place on the night of February 19th, 1944. Schnaufer was flying his Bf-110, which was fitted with Fuji 220 Liechtenstein SN2 radar. His crew consisted of a radar operator and a rear gunner. British bombers were heading for Leipzig. The bomber stream was miles long, a river of aircraft flowing through the night. Schnaufer's job was to find that river. Guided by ground controllers, he flew to the predicted location of the bomber stream. Then his radar operator, Fritz Rumpelhart, would go to work. The radar screen was a primitive flickering cathode ray tube. Blips of light called contacts would appear. Rumpelhart had to interpret these blips, filtering out false signals and guiding Schnaufer towards a real target. It was an art as much as a science. Contact, 10 degrees to port, range 3 kilometers, he might say. So Schnaufer would alter course, his eyes straining to see something in the blackness. The bomber crews could not see him. They flew on, a dark shape against a slightly less dark sky. As the range closed, Schnaufer would descend below the bomber. Many German night fighters were equipped with Schräge Musik, which translates to slanting music. This was a pair of upward-firing cannons mounted in the fuselage. It was a devastatingly effective weapon. From directly underneath the bomber, in its blind spot, Schnaufer would slow his aircraft to match the speed of the Lancaster or Halifax above him. He could see the massive silhouette of the bomber against the stars. He would take his time, line up his shot, and fire. The cannon shells would rip into the bomber's wing, often hitting a fuel tank. There would be a bright flash, and the bomber would erupt in a ball of fire. The entire process could take just a few seconds. Then, Schnaufer would bank away and begin the hunt for his next victim. On a good night, a skilled crew could repeat this process several times. On that February night, Schnaufer and his crew claimed 2 Lancasters. His most successful night was March 24th, 1944, when he claimed 5 bombers. The book Nakjad, The Night Fighter War, 1939-1945 by Theo Boyton details the technological arms race that defined this type of combat. The British developed Window, strips of aluminum foil dropped by bombers to create a cloud of false radar returns. The Germans developed new radar frequencies. The British developed new radar warning receivers. It was a constant back and forth. Schnaufer's success was due not just to his skill as a pilot, but to the seamless teamwork between him and his radar operator. They were a single hunting unit. This was a different kind of war. There was no eye contact, no salutes between honorable foes. It was cold, calculated, and deadly. The bomber crews were often helpless, unaware of the predator stalking them from below until it was too late. What secrets of early radar technology are still buried in lost German technical documents? How many bomber crews survived an attack from a night fighter but never even knew what had hit them, reporting it simply as flak? And what was the psychological toll on the night fighter crews themselves, who witnessed the violent destruction of hundreds of enemy airmen, often seeing the planes burn for minutes as they fell to earth? Number 14. Could a man with no legs become a legend? Douglas Bader was not a typical fighter pilot. In 1931, while performing low-level aerobatics, he crashed his plane. He survived, but he lost both of his legs. The Royal Air Force discharged him. For most people, that would have been the end of a flying career. But Bader was not most people. When the war broke out in 1939, Bader fought his way back into the RAF. He had to prove he could fly just as well with his artificial tin legs as any other pilot. He not only proved it, he excelled. By the summer of 1940, during the Battle of Britain, he was a squadron leader, in command of number 242 Squadron. Bader was a controversial figure. He was brash, opinionated, and often clashed with his superiors. He was a firm believer in the big wing theory, championed by his superior Trafford Leigh-Mallory. The idea was to meet large German bomber formations with an equally large formation of British fighters. This was in direct opposition to the tactics of Fighter Command's leader Hugh Dowding, who preferred to send smaller squadrons to harass the enemy. On September 15, 1940, a day that would become known as Battle of Britain Day, Bader got his chance to prove his theory. A massive German raid was detected heading for London. Bader was given command of a big wing consisting of 5 squadrons. It was a huge force of over 60 fighters. He led them into the air, climbing to meet the enemy. The sight of this huge formation of Spitfires and Hurricanes must have been a shock to the German bomber crews and their fighter escorts. Instead of being picked off by small groups of fighters, they were hit by a wall of British aircraft. The fight that followed was a massive swirling dogfight involving over 100 planes. Bader was in the thick of it. His combat reports, detailed in his biography, Reach for the Sky by Paul Brickhill, describe the chaos. He dived on a formation of Dornier Du 17 bombers, firing at one until he saw smoke pouring from its engine. He then engaged a Messerschmitt Bf 109, chasing it in a series of tight turns. He was a skilled pilot, and his lack of legs was in some ways an advantage. He could withstand higher G-forces than other pilots because the blood could not drain from his legs. He was, in effect, a ready-made anti-G suit. The big wing tactic was a success that day. Bader's formation claimed to have shot down dozens of German planes, breaking up the bomber formation and forcing them to turn back. The psychological impact was immense. The Luftwaffe had believed the RAF was on its last legs. The appearance of such a large, coordinated fighter force suggested otherwise. September 15th is widely considered the turning point of the Battle of Britain, and Bader's big wing played a significant role. The effectiveness of the big wing is still a subject of historical debate. Critics argue that it took too long to assemble, often arriving after the bombers had already hit their targets. But there is no denying the legend of Douglas Bader himself. He was a symbol of defiance, a man who refused to be grounded by a catastrophic injury, and went on to become one of the war's most famous aces. How much of Bader's success was due to his unique physical condition, which allowed him to tolerate G-forces that would make other pilots black out? Did his aggressive personality, which so often got him into trouble on the ground, make him a more effective leader in the air? And are there any surviving German accounts that specifically describe the shock of encountering a big wing for the first time? Number 13, what happens when a jet fights a propeller? By late 1944, the skies over Germany belonged to the Allies. American P-51 Mustangs could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The German fighter force was decimated, worn down by years of attrition, but Germany had one last surprise: the Messerschmitt Me-262 Schwalbe, the world's first operational jet fighter. For an American Mustang pilot, seeing a Me-262 for the first time was a terrifying experience. It was over 100 miles per hour faster than any propeller-driven plane. It carried 4 30mm cannons, a weapon powerful enough to destroy a B-17 bomber with a single short burst. It looked and sounded like something from the future. The P-51 Mustang was arguably the best piston engine fighter of the war, but in a straight line, it stood no chance against the German jet. So how do you fight an enemy you can't catch? This was the question facing pilots like Chuck Yeager of the 357th Fighter Group. Yeager, who would later become the first man to break the sound barrier, was already an accomplished ace. He and his fellow pilots had to develop new tactics on the fly. A classic encounter happened on November 6, 1944. Yeager was leading his flight of Mustangs when he saw 3 Me-262s below him. The jets were in the process of attacking a group of American bombers. Yeager knew he couldn't catch them in a straight chase. The only chance was to catch them when they were vulnerable. The jets were at their worst during takeoff, landing, or when they were already committed to a turn. Yeager and his squadron dived on the jets. The Me-262s saw them coming and tried to use their speed to escape. But one of the German pilots made a mistake. Instead of a shallow, high-speed climb, he made a gentle turn. That was the opening Yeager needed. As described in his autobiography, Yeager! He cut across the circle, aimed his 6.50 caliber machine guns, and fired. The jet, which seemed so invincible moments before, burst into flames. Yeager had shot down an Me-262. This became the standard tactic. Allied pilots would orbit high above German airfields known to host jets. They would wait for the Me-262s to take off or land. When they were slow and unmaneuverable, it was dangerous work. The airfields were heavily defended by anti-aircraft guns, but it was the only way to effectively counter the jet threat. Another tactic was to use the Mustang's superior maneuverability. If a jet pilot could be baited into a turning fight, the Mustang had the advantage. But most German pilots were too experienced to fall for that trap. They would use their boom and zoom tactics, dive on the bombers at high speed, fire, and then use their superior speed to climb away untouchable. The Me-262 was a revolutionary aircraft, but it came too late and in too few numbers to change the course of the war. It also suffered from unreliable engines that had a short lifespan, but for the Allied pilots who had to face it, it was a glimpse of the future of air combat. The jet age began in the skies over Germany in 1944. The encounters between the P-51 and the Me-262 were a clash between two different eras of aviation technology. The skill and tactical innovation of the Allied pilots managed to hold the line against a technologically superior foe. How many Me-262s were lost, not to enemy action, but to engine failure or landing accidents, problems that are often overlooked in combat statistics? Did the German jet pilots feel a sense of invincibility, and did this lead them to make tactical errors they wouldn't have made in a propeller plane? And are there still undiscovered design documents for more advanced German jets that, had they been built, could have posed an even greater threat? Number 12, can you be the best in the world's worst plane? In 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the Finnish Air Force found itself in a desperate situation. They were allied with Germany, fighting the Soviets, but they did not have access to the best German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109. Instead, their top fighter was the Brewster B-239 Buffalo. In the United States and Great Britain, the Buffalo had a terrible reputation. It was considered overweight, underpowered, and unmaneuverable. British pilots in Asia nicknamed it the Flying Coffin. It was completely outclassed by the Japanese Zero, but in the hands of Finnish pilots, the Flying Coffin became one of the most successful fighter planes of the war. The top Finnish ace was Ilmari Juutalainen. He scored 94 confirmed victories, making him the highest-scoring non-German ace of all time. An incredible 34 of those victories were achieved while flying the Brewster Buffalo. How was this possible? How could pilots in a supposedly terrible plane achieve such amazing results? The answer is a combination of factors. First, the Finnish pilots were highly skilled and rigorously trained. Second, the version of the Buffalo they flew was a lighter, earlier model without the heavy equipment that weighed down the later versions. The third, and most importantly, their enemy was different. In the early stages of the war on the Eastern Front, the Soviet Air Force was in a state of disarray. They flew outdated planes like the Polikarpov I-153 biplane and the I-16. Against these, the Buffalo was a formidable opponent. A typical engagement for Juutalainen, described in books like Finland's War of Choice by Henrik Lunde, would involve using the Buffalo's strengths. While it couldn't climb or turn with some fighters, it was a good dive bomber and had a rugged construction. And Juutalainen was a master of deflection shooting, the difficult art of firing at where the enemy will be, not where he is. On a mission in February 1942, Juutalainen and his wingman encountered 7 Soviet I-153 biplanes. The Soviet planes were extremely maneuverable at low speeds. A classic turning dogfight would have been foolish. Instead, Juutalainen used his plane's superior speed. He made a high-speed pass, fired a burst at one of the biplanes, and then used his momentum to climb away. He would then circle around and repeat the process. This boom and zoom tactic was the key to his success. He refused to get drawn into a low-speed turning fight where the biplanes had an advantage. In that one engagement, he shot down 2 enemy aircraft. The Finnish mechanics also played a crucial role. They were masters of improvisation, keeping the small fleet of Buffaloes airworthy with limited spare parts. They even modified the planes to better suit the harsh Finnish winters. The story of the Finnish Buffalo pilots is a powerful reminder that the quality of a weapon is often determined by the skill of the person using it and the context in which it is used. The Finns called their Buffalo Taivan Helmi, or Sky Pearl. This is in stark contrast to how the plane was viewed by almost every other air force. It proves that there is no such thing as a universally bawd aircraft. A plane's effectiveness depends on its opponent, the tactics used, and the skill of its pilot. How much of the Buffalo's success was due to the poor quality of early Soviet aircraft and pilot training, a factor that is often downplayed in Western accounts of the air war? Are there detailed Finnish maintenance logs that could reveal the secret modifications they made to get such high performance out of the aircraft? And what did Soviet pilots report back to their commanders after being consistently defeated by a plane the rest of the world considered a failure? Or number 11, was this a duel of honor or a desperate gamble? The Solomon Islands campaign in 1943 was a brutal, grinding affair. It was a war of tropical heat, disease, and ferocious combat. In the air, it was the stage for some of the most intense dogfighting of the Pacific War. American Marine Corps pilots flying the new Vought F-4U Corsair were pitted against veteran Japanese pilots, many of them in the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0. One of the most famous American aces of this period was Major Gregory Pappy Boyington, leader of VMF 214, the Black Sheep Squadron. Boyington was a larger-than-life character. He was older than most of his pilots, hence the nickname Pappy, a hard drinker, and a brawler. He was also a supremely gifted and aggressive fighter pilot. The legend of Pappy Boyington is filled with stories of incredible dogfights, but one stands out. On October 17, 1943, Boyington was leading a fighter sweep over the Japanese-held island of Kahili. The American pilots were heavily outnumbered. Boyington's flight of 12 Corsairs was attacked by a much larger force of Zeros. The ensuing dogfight, as recounted in Boyington's own memoir, Ba Ba Black Sheep, was a chaotic swirl of planes. The Corsair and the Zero were very different machines. The Zero was light and agile, the master of the turning fight. The Corsair was a beast, powerful and incredibly fast, but less nimble. The key to victory for a Corsair pilot was to use his plane's speed and firepower, and to avoid a turning contest with a Zero. During the fight, Boyington found himself in a one-on-one duel with a Japanese ace. The two pilots were perfectly matched. They twisted and turned, each trying to get on the other's tail. Boyington tried to use his Corsair's superior horsepower to climb away, but the Japanese pilot stayed with him. He tried to dive, but the Zero was right behind him. This was not a simple boom and zoom attack, it was a classic personal duel between two masters of their craft. Finally, Boyington saw an opening. He pulled his Corsair into a steep climbing turn. The Zero pilot, trying to follow, momentarily stalled his aircraft. For a fraction of a second, the Japanese plane hung in the air, vulnerable. That was all the time Boyington needed. He rolled his Corsair over, aimed his 6.50 caliber machine guns, and fired. The Zero exploded. This single fight was a microcosm of the entire air war in the Solomons. It was about skill, guts, and understanding the strengths and weaknesses of your machine. Boyington went on to become one of the top Marine aces of the war, with 26 confirmed victories. His aggressive leadership and the combat success of the Black Sheep Squadron became a powerful source of propaganda and a boost to morale back home. Boyington's combat record is subject of some controversy. Some historians suggest his score was inflated and that he took credit for kills made by his squadron mates. But no one disputes his skill as a pilot or his importance as a leader. He was the right man at the right time, a symbol of American defiance in a brutal campaign. How much of the Black Sheep Squadron's success was due to Boyington's individual skill, and how much was due to the overall quality of the Marine pilots he led? Are there Japanese records that identify the ace pilot Boyington dueled with on that day? And how did the intense personal nature of these one-on-one dogfights affect the psychological state of the pilots who survived them? Number 10. What makes a fighter pilot spare his enemy? On December 20th, 1943, a young American pilot named Charlie Brown was in serious trouble. He was the pilot of a B-17 bomber named the Old Pub. They had just completed a bombing run over Bremen, Germany, and the plane was shot to pieces. One engine was dead, another was failing. The bomber's hydraulic and oxygen systems were gone. The tail gunner was dead, and most of the crew were wounded. The plane was flying alone, a crippled straggler, deep inside enemy territory. That's when Franz Stigler saw it. Stigler was a German ace, a veteran pilot with over 20 victories. He was flying a Messerschmitt Bf 109. He had just rearmed and refueled and was taking off to hunt for stragglers. The B-17 was a perfect, easy target. Shooting it down would earn him the Knight's Cross, one of Germany's highest military honors. Stigler closed in on the American bomber from behind. It wasn't even firing at him. The tail guns were silent. As he got closer, he could see the extent of the damage. The plane was riddled with holes. He could see the wounded and terrified crew members inside. For Stigler, something changed. This was not combat. This was an execution. He later recalled the words of one of his commanding officers from his time fighting in North Africa. You fight by the rules of war for your own inner sense of honor. If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself. He felt that shooting down this crippled plane would be the same as shooting a man in a parachute. Instead of firing his cannons, Stigler pulled his Bf 109 alongside the B-17's cockpit. Charlie Brown and his co-pilot looked over and saw the enemy fighter just feet away. They were terrified, certain this was the end. But the German pilot didn't shoot. He looked Brown in the eyes and made a gesture. He was trying to get them to land in Germany and surrender or to fly to neutral Sweden. Brown didn't understand. Stigler saw that the B-17 was determined to fly for England, so he did something extraordinary. He decided to escort the bomber. He flew his fighter in close formation with the B-17. He knew that this would keep German anti-aircraft gunners on the ground from firing at the American plane, as they would risk hitting one of their own. He flew with them all the way to the North Sea coast. Once they were over the water and out of German airspace, Stigler gave the American crew a salute, peeled his fighter away, and returned to his base. And Charlie Brown managed to fly the battered Ye Old Pub back to its base in England. He reported the incident, but his superiors told him to keep quiet. They didn't want to create stories that humanized the enemy. Franz Stigler never spoke of the incident either. If his superiors had found out he had let an enemy bomber escape, he would have been court-martialed and likely shot. He simply reported that he had engaged a B-17 and it had gone down over the sea. The story remained a secret for decades. The full account is detailed in the book A Higher Call by Adam Makos. After the war, Charlie Brown spent years searching for the German pilot who had saved him and his crew. In 1990, he finally found Franz Stigler, who was living in Canada. The two men became close friends until their deaths. This was not a dogfight in the traditional sense, it was a duel of conscience. It is one of the most powerful examples of chivalry and humanity in the midst of a brutal war. It reminds us that even in the most extreme circumstances, a person's individual sense of morality can override their orders and their training. How many other undocumented acts of chivalry occurred in the skies, lost to history because both sides had to remain silent? If Stigler had been flying with a wingman, would he have been forced to shoot down the bomber to maintain appearances? And what does this incident tell us about the conflict between personal morality and the orders of a state at war? Number 9. Could one group of pilots redefine a nation's prejudice? In the United States during the 1939 to 1945 war, the military was segregated. There was a widespread and deeply racist belief that African Americans were not capable of being military pilots. They were thought to lack the intelligence, courage, and discipline required. A 1925 U.S. Army War College study had concluded that black people were subservient and mentally inferior. Despite this, a group of African American men was selected for a military experiment to see if they could be trained as pilots. They were trained at a segregated airbase in Tuskegee, Alabama. They became known as the Tuskegee Airmen. They faced constant discrimination, they were given inferior equipment, and were often sidelined from combat. Many in the military command expected, and even hoped, they would fail. They did not fail. The 332nd Fighter Group, the most famous unit of the Tuskegee Airmen, was deployed to Italy in 1944. They flew bomber escort missions. Their primary job was to protect formations of American B-17 and B-24 bombers from German fighters. They painted the tails of their P-51 Mustangs red, earning them the nickname Red Tails. The Red Tails quickly developed a reputation for being the best in the business. While other fighter escort groups would often chase German fighters for individual glory, leaving the bombers unprotected, the Red Tails had a different doctrine. Their commanders, particularly Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr., instilled a strict discipline. Their primary mission was to protect the bombers. Stay with the little friends, as the bomber crews called them. This discipline paid off. Bomber crews began to specifically request the Red Tails as their escorts. They knew that if the Red Tails were on the job, their chances of getting home were much higher. A famous legend grew that the 332nd Fighter Group never lost a single bomber to enemy fighters. While historical research, including the book The Tuskegee Airmen, An Illustrated History by Joseph Caver, has shown this is not strictly true, they lost around 27 bombers. Their loss rate was dramatically lower than that of other escort groups. A classic example of their work was on March 24th, 1945. The 332nd was escorting a massive formation of B-17s on a raid to Berlin. This was the longest and most dangerous mission they had ever flown. Over the target, they were attacked by a group of advanced German jet fighters, the Me-262s. The jets were much faster than the Mustangs, but the Tuskegee Airmen held their ground. They engaged the jets, disrupting their attacks and shooting down 3 of them for no losses of their own. They protected the bomber formation and brought them home safely. It was a stunning display of skill and courage. The dogfights of the Tuskegee Airmen were not just battles against an external enemy. they were also battles against prejudice at home. Every German plane they shot down, every bomber they brought home safely was a blow against the racism that had tried to keep them on the ground. Their combat record was undeniable proof of their skill and patriotism. How did the Tuskegee Airmen's unique mission focus on protecting bombers above all else contribute to their low bomber loss rate compared to other groups that prioritize shooting down enemy fighters? Are there surviving German pilot accounts that specifically mention encountering the distinctive red-tailed Mustangs? And what was the immediate unrecorded reaction of white bomber crews when they realized their lives were being protected by the very men their society had deemed inferior? Number 8, was he the greatest ace you've never heard of? When people talk about the great aces of the war, they often mention names like Erich Hartmann from Germany or Richard Bong from the United States. But one of the most remarkable and often overlooked aces was an Irishman named Brendan Paddy Finucane. Finucane was young, handsome, and incredibly talented. He joined the Royal Air Force in 1938. By the summer of 1941, at the age of just 20, he was already a flying ace and a flight commander. He flew the Supermarine Spitfire, and he was a master of it. He was known for his incredible eyesight and his uncanny ability to see enemy aircraft long before anyone else in his squadron. His most legendary day of combat was on October 13, 1941. Finucane was leading his squadron of Spitfires on a fighter sweep over northern France. They encountered a large formation of Messerschmitt Bf-109s. The ensuing dogfight was a classic test of skill and nerve. Finucane was a proponent of teamwork and disciplined formations. As detailed in the biography Paddy Finucane Fighter Ace by Doug Stokes, he did not fight like a lone wolf. He led his squadron as a cohesive unit. In the fight that day, he demonstrated his personal skill as well. He spotted a Bf-109 diving on one of his wingmen. Finucane executed a perfect climbing turn, getting inside the German fighter's turn and placing himself on its tail. A short, accurate burst from his cannons and machine guns was all it took. The 109 fell away. Moments later, he was in a head-on attack with another 109. This was the most dangerous maneuver in air combat, a deadly game of chicken. Both pilots are firing at each other, and a collision is a real possibility. Finucane held his fire until the last possible second, then fired a burst that struck the enemy's engine. He broke away just in time to avoid the debris. In that single mission, he was credited with shooting down 3 Bf-109s. By the age of 21, Paddy Finucane was a wing commander, the youngest in the history of the RAF. He had 28 confirmed victories. He was a national hero. His picture was on the cover of magazines. He was the embodiment of the dashing fighter pilot. Tragically, his career was cut short. In July 1942, his Spitfire was hit by ground fire during a low-level attack in France. His engine failed, and he was forced to ditch in the English Channel. He and his plane were never seen again. He was just 21 years old. Paddy Finucane's stories went a meteoric rise and tragic loss. In just over a year of combat, he became one of the top aces in the RAF. He was a superb pilot, a natural leader, and an inspiration to the public. His legend is not just about the number of planes he shot down, but about the incredible skill he displayed at such a young age. What if Finucane had not been killed in 1942? Could he have gone on to become the highest-scoring Allied ace of the war? How much of his success can be attributed to these specific performance characteristics of the Spitfire Mach V that he flew for most of his career? And are there still undiscovered personal letters or diaries from the pilots who flew with him that could give us a deeper insight into his personality and leadership style? Number 7. How does one man shoot down 352 planes? The numbers are difficult to comprehend. Erich Hartmann, a German pilot, was credited with 352 confirmed aerial victories. This is the highest score of any fighter ace in history. To put that in perspective, the top American ace, Richard Bong, had 40. The top British ace, Johnny Johnson, had 38. Hartmann's score seems almost superhuman. How did he do it? Hartmann flew exclusively on the Eastern Front, fighting against the Soviet Air Force. He flew the Messerschmitt Bf-109 for his entire career. He was not a flashy, acrobatic dogfighter. In fact, he considered long, turning dogfights to be a waste of time and ammunition. His method was a cold, calculated, and brutally efficient system of ambush. He called it C, decide, attack, break. First, C. Hartmann had excellent eyesight and was a master of spotting enemy aircraft before they spotted him. He would use the sun, clouds, and the terrain to his advantage, staying hidden. Second, decide. Once he saw the enemy, he would evaluate the situation. Was he outnumbered? Did he have the advantage of altitude or speed? He would not attack unless the situation was in his favor. If it wasn't, he would simply wait for a better opportunity. There was no ego in his flying. Third, attack. This was the core of his technique. Hartmann was not interested in a long-range shootout. He would get terrifyingly close to his target, often closing to 50 meters or less before opening fire. At this range, he couldn't miss. His goal was to destroy the enemy with a single, short, accurate burst. This conserved ammunition and gave the enemy pilot no time to react. He once said, "Get in close, and when his plane fills your whole windscreen, you can't miss." And fourth, break. As soon as he fired, he would break away. He would use the speed of his diving attack to escape before the enemy's wingmen even knew what had happened. He never lingered to watch his victim go down. He would immediately climb back up to a position of advantage and begin the process all over again. This four-step process, described in the books The Blonde Knight of Germany by Raymond Tolliver and Trevor Constable, was more like a science than an art. It was a repeatable, low-risk, high-reward system. On one day, August 24th, 1943, he shot down 7 Soviet aircraft in a single day. His 352 victories were not achieved in 352 separate missions. They came in clusters, a result of his brutally efficient hunting method. He was shot down or forced to land 16 times, but he was never wounded. Hartmann's record is, and will likely forever remain, the pinnacle of aerial combat achievement. However, it's crucial to understand the context. He fought on the Eastern Front, where the scale of combat was immense. The Soviet Air Force often used less experienced pilots and less advanced aircraft, particularly early in the war. This is not to diminish his skill, but to explain the conditions that made such a score possible. How much of Hartmann's success was due to the specific conditions of the Eastern Front, and how would he have fared against the highly trained RAF and USAF pilots on the Western Front? Are there detailed Soviet combat archives that could independently verify all 352 of his claims? And what was the psychological effect on Soviet pilots who knew they were sharing the sky with a nearly invisible predator who had already shot down hundreds of their comrades? Number 6, could you fly home with half your head blown off? Saburo Sakai was one of Japan's greatest fighter aces. He was a samurai in the cockpit, a deeply disciplined and skilled pilot who flew the Mitsubishi A6M0. By August 1942, he had already shot down over 60 Allied aircraft. He seemed invincible. On August 7th, 1942, during the American invasion of Guadalcanal, Sakai and his squadron took off from Rabaul on a long-range mission to attack the American fleet. It was a grueling flight of over 560 miles, a testament to the Zero's incredible range. Over Guadalcanal, they engaged American fighters and bombers. During the chaotic dogfight, Sakai spotted a formation of what he thought were F-4F Wildcat fighters. He dived to attack them from behind. As he got closer, he realized his mistake. They were not fighters. They were SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and a dive bomber has a rear gunner. Before Sakai could break away, the combined fire from the bomber's rear machine guns ripped through his cockpit. A bullet shattered his canopy and struck him in the head. The impact was devastating. It blew away part of his skull, blinded him in his right eye, and paralyzed the left side of his body. His Zero went into a dive, spiraling towards the sea. This is where the story becomes a legend of human endurance. Sakai was unconscious, spinning towards death. The cold air rushing into the cockpit revived him. He was in unimaginable pain, but he couldn't see, out of one eye. His left arm and leg were useless. But he was a samurai. Surrender or failure was not an option. He managed to regain control of the plane with his right arm and leg. He was still over enemy territory, bleeding profusely and semi-paralyzed. He now had to fly the 560 miles back to his base at Rabaul. It was a 4.5-hour flight. He was constantly drifting in and out of consciousness. He thought about crashing his plane into an American ship, a final act of defiance. But he decided his duty was to return and report on the battle. As he flew, he used his silk scarf to bandage his head, trying to stop the bleeding. The pain was so intense he considered ending his own life. But he kept flying. He navigated by instinct and memory, a faint line of islands on the horizon. His account of this flight in his autobiography, Samurai, is a harrowing tale of willpower against physical collapse. When he finally reached Rabaul, he was so weak he could barely land the plane. He circled the airfield 4 times, trying to stay conscious. He finally managed to put the plane down. When the ground crew pulled him from the cockpit, he was covered in blood and barely alive. He had flown for almost 5 hours with a catastrophic head wound. Saburo Sakai survived. After months of surgery, he returned to flying, despite being blind in one eye. His epic flight from Guadalcanal is one of the most incredible survival stories of the entire war. It is a testament not just to his skill as a pilot, but to a level of mental and physical fortitude that is almost beyond comprehension. What specific physiological and psychological mechanisms allowed a human being to withstand that level of trauma and still perform the complex task of flying an airplane for over 4 hours? Are there American combat reports from the dauntless gunners who shot him down that describe the encounter from their perspective? And how did Sakai's experience, which demonstrated the Zero's vulnerability to rear gunner fire, influence Japanese fighter tactics later in the war? Number 5. Did a woman's fury rule the skies of Stalingrad? In the Soviet Union, women were not just factory workers and medics. They were also frontline soldiers, snipers, and pilots. A group of female aviators organized into 3 all-female air regiments flew combat missions. One of the most famous of these women was Lydia Litviak. Litviak was small, blonde, and beautiful. She loved to paint flowers on the side of her Yakovlev Yak-1 fighter. She was known as the White Lily of Stalingrad, but in the cockpit, she was a deadly and aggressive pilot. She became one of the world's only 2 female fighter aces, and her story is a legend of the Eastern Front. She got her first taste of combat during the brutal Battle of Stalingrad in late 1942. The fighting in the air was as savage as the fighting on the ground. On September 13, 1942, she shot down her first 2 aircraft, a Ju-88 bomber and a Bf-109 fighter that was on its tail. The pilot of the Bf-109, a German ace, was captured. He demanded to see the Russian pilot who had outflown him. When the diminutive 21-year-old Litviak was brought before him, he refused to believe it until she described their dogfight, maneuver by maneuver. Litviak became a free hunter, a pilot given the freedom to seek out and engage enemy aircraft on their own. It was a role reserved for the best and most aggressive pilots. She was known for her sharp eyes and her intuitive understanding of aerial combat. She fought with a fierce determination driven by the loss of loved ones and the defense of her homeland. So, one of her most famous dogfights occurred in March 1943. Litviak was leading her flight when they encountered a formation of German Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers escorted by Bf-109s. The classic scenario would be for the Soviet fighters to engage the German fighter escort. Litviak did the opposite. She ignored the fighters and dived straight for the bombers. Her attack was so swift and unexpected that she shot down a Stuka before the escorts could react. She was then jumped by the Bf-109s. She found herself in a one-on-one turning dogfight with a German fighter. The Yak-1 was a nimble aircraft, and Litviak was a master of using it to its full potential. The 2 planes twisted through the sky. Litviak managed to get on the German's tail and shot him down. She then turned her attention back to the bombers. In the course of that single battle, she shot down 2 German aircraft and damaged a 3rd. It was a remarkable display of skill and tactical brilliance. Tragically, like so many aces, her luck ran out. On August 1st, 1943, during the Battle of Kursk, she was on her 4th mission of the day. Her squadron was attacked by a group of Bf-109s. She was last seen in a desperate dogfight, her Yak-1 pouring smoke. She was just 21 years old. Her body was not found until 1979. Lydia Litviak was credited with 12 solo victories and several shared kills. Her story, and that of the other Soviet female pilots, challenges our perceptions of women's roles in combat. They were not just symbols, they were effective and deadly warriors. The book, A Dance with Death, Soviet Air Women in World War II by Anne Nagel provides a detailed account of their experiences. Why has the story of the Soviet female fighter pilots been so relatively unknown in the West for so long? Are there undiscovered German combat reports that specifically mention encounters with female Soviet pilots? And did they perceive any difference in their fighting style? And how did the male Soviet pilots, operating in a deeply patriarchal society, truly feel about flying alongside and sometimes being led by women in combat? Number 4. Could a heavyweight brawler beat a fencing master? In the air war over Europe, 2 of the most iconic fighters were the German Focke-Wulf FW-190 and the American Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. They were in many ways philosophical opposites. The FW-190 was a masterpiece of German engineering. It was light, agile, heavily armed with cannons, and powered by a finely tuned radial engine. It was a fencer's rapier. The P-47 Thunderbolt, on the other hand, was a monster. It was the largest and heaviest single-engine fighter of the war. Its pilots nicknamed it the Jug. It was a heavyweight boxer's sledgehammer. On paper, the FW-190 should have been superior in a classic dogfight. It could outturn and outclimb the massive P-47, but the American pilots quickly learned that you don't fight a fencer on his own terms. You use your strengths. And the Jug's greatest strength was its incredible speed in a dive. A perfect example of this clash of styles took place in the spring of 1944. A squadron of P-47s was escorting bombers over Germany. They were attacked by a group of FW-190s. A German pilot might try to lure a Thunderbolt into a turning fight, where the FW-190 had the advantage. An experienced P-47 pilot like Robert S. Johnson, one of the top American aces in Europe, knew better than to take the bait. As described in his book Thunderbolt, Johnson's tactic was simple and brutal. When attacked, he wouldn't turn. He would dive. The P-47, with its immense weight and powerful engine, could dive faster than almost anything in the sky. It could reach incredible speeds, sometimes pushing the limits of structural integrity. An FW-190 that tried to follow a P-47 in a dive would often be left behind. Once Johnson had built up a huge speed advantage in a dive, he would convert that speed back into altitude, climbing back up in a wide, sweeping maneuver. He was now above his opponent, holding all the cards. He would then roll over and dive again, this time on the attack. His 8.50 caliber machine guns, a weapon of incredible destructive power, would shred the lighter German fighter. This was the essence of energy fighting. It was not about graceful turns, it was about managing your plane's speed and altitude. The P-47 pilots became masters of this. They would work in teams, with one pair of pilots diving to attack while another pair stayed high, providing cover. They turned their plane's greatest weakness, its weight, into its greatest weapon. The FW-190 pilots, who were used to being the kings of the sky, suddenly found themselves dealing with an opponent who wouldn't play by their rules. The P-47 Thunderbolt was also incredibly tough. Its rugged construction and powerful radial engine could absorb an enormous amount of damage and still bring its pilot home. There are countless stories of Jugs returning to base with cylinders shot off, wings riddled with holes, and even missing pieces of the tail. This resilience, combined with its high altitude performance and diving speed, made it one of the most effective fighters of the war. How many P-47s were saved by their sheer toughness? A factor that is difficult to quantify but was critical to pilot survival and morale. Did German FW-190 pilots have to develop entirely new dogfighting doctrines specifically to counter the unique energy fighting tactics of the Thunderbolt? And are there engineering documents that show how the designers of the P-47 intentionally prioritized survivability and speed over maneuverability, a choice that went against traditional fighter design philosophy? Number 3, how do you fight when the sun is your enemy? Hans-Joachim Marseille was a German fighter pilot who fought almost exclusively in the desert skies of North Africa. He was a master of the Messerschmitt Bf 109. He was also a rebel. He was known for his flamboyant lifestyle, his love of American jazz music, and his often insubordinate attitude. But in the air, he was a genius. He became known as the Star of Africa. His specialty was a kind of aerial combat that almost no other pilot could master. He was the undisputed king of deflection shooting. This is the art of shooting not at the enemy plane itself, but at the point in space where it will be in a few moments. It requires an incredible amount of skill, a natural feel for geometry, and an almost psychic ability to predict the enemy's movements. Marseille's most legendary day was September 1st, 1942. He flew 3 missions that day. On the first mission, he and his squadron engaged a formation of British Spitfires. Marseille broke away from his own formation and dived into the enemy. His technique was unique. He wouldn't get on an enemy's tail in the traditional way. Instead, he would close in from the side in a tight, high-speed turn. He would fire a very short, very accurate burst at the front of the enemy plane. The bullets would hit the engine and the cockpit. The enemy plane would fall away, and Marseille would already be lining up his next shot. His attacks were so fast that the British pilots often didn't even see him coming. In that one fight, which lasted only a few minutes, he shot down 4 Spitfires. He landed, refueled, rearmed, and took off again. This time he encountered a formation of American P-40 Kitty Hawks. He used the same tactics. He would dive, turn sharply, fire a short burst, and then use his speed to climb away and set up his next attack. He never got bogged down in a turning fight with a single opponent. He was constantly moving, a whirlwind of deadly precision. In this second mission, he shot down 5 P-40s. He flew a third mission late in the afternoon. He found a formation of Spitfires and once again tore into them. He shot down another 8. In a single day, Hans-Joachim Marseille had shot down 17 Allied aircraft. It is a feat of air combat that has never been equaled. He had done it with incredible efficiency, using an average of just 15 bullets per kill. The details of his tactics are analyzed in books like Hans-Joachim Marseille, an illustrated tribute to the Luftwaffe's Star of Africa. He used the blinding desert sun, the chaotic nature of a dogfight, and his own unparalleled skill to become a phantom. Allied pilots who survived encounters with him often reported being attacked by a much larger force of German fighters, unable to believe that one man could cause so much destruction. Marseille's career was brilliant but brief. On September 30th, 1942, just weeks after his greatest day, his brand new Bf-109G2 suffered an engine failure. The cockpit filled with smoke. He was forced to bail out. He hit the tail of his plane and was killed. He had 158 victories, almost all of them against the skilled pilots of the Western Allies. What was it in Marseille's brain that allowed him to master the complex mathematics of deflection shooting in a way that no other pilot could? Are there undiscovered Allied intelligence reports that tried to analyze his unique tactics? And did they ever come close to understanding how he fought? And if he had not been killed in an accident, is it possible his score could have rivaled even that of the top aces on the Eastern Front? Or number 2, who was America's ace of aces? Richard Dick. Bong was the complete opposite of the dashing, flamboyant fighter pilot stereotype. He was a quiet, unassuming farm boy from Wisconsin. He was a poor shot in gunnery school, he disliked military discipline, but when he climbed into the cockpit of a Lockheed P-38 Lightning, he became the deadliest American pilot of the war. Bong fought entirely in the Pacific Theater. The P-38 was a unique aircraft. It had 2 engines, 2 fuselages, and a central cockpit pod. It was fast, could climb well, and had a concentrated package of 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon in the nose. This meant its fire was concentrated in a straight line, making it easier to aim than the wing-mounted guns of most fighters. Bong was not a great dogfighter in the classic sense. Like Eric Hartmann, he was a hunter. He rarely engaged in turning fights. His method was to use the P-38's speed and firepower to make a single, devastating pass. He was a master of the ambush. He would use his excellent eyesight to spot enemy formations, maneuver into a superior position, usually with the sun at his back, and then dive on them. A typical Bong victory, and he had 40 of them, was a model of efficiency. On a mission over New Guinea in late 1943, he spotted a formation of Japanese Oscar fighters. They were known for their incredible maneuverability. Bong knew that getting into a turning fight with them was suicide for a heavy P-38. So he didn't. He came down on them from high altitude, his twin engine screaming. He lined up on the last plane in the formation, got extremely close, and fired a single long burst. The concentrated firepower of the P-38's nose guns would tear the lightly built Japanese plane apart. He would then continue his dive, using his speed to escape before the other Japanese pilots could react. He repeated this tactic over and over. He became so good at it that he was eventually taken off combat duty. He was a national hero, and the military command felt he was too valuable to risk losing. They sent him home to marry his sweetheart and go on war bond tours. He was America's ace of aces, a symbol of American air power. His story is well documented in books like Ace of Aces: The Life of Dick Bong by General George C. Kenney. Tragically, Bong's story ends in heartbreak. After returning home, he became a test pilot for America's first jet fighter, the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star. On August 6, 1945, the same day the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, his P-80 suffered a fuel pump failure on takeoff. He bailed out, but he was too low. He was killed. He was just 24 years old. Richard Bong's career highlights the American approach to air combat in the Pacific. It was not about individual duels of honor, it was about the methodical application of superior technology and firepower. Bong was the ultimate practitioner of this doctrine. He was a quiet, efficient killer who did his job better than anyone else. How much of Bong's success was due to the unique characteristics of the P-38 Lightning with its concentrated nose-mounted armament? Did Japanese intelligence ever identify Bong as a particularly dangerous pilot and issue specific warnings or tactics to counter him? And what does it say about the nature of heroism that America's greatest ace was not a swashbuckling dogfighter, but a quiet, methodical hunter? Number one, what if the greatest dogfight was a fight to survive? Sometimes the most epic dogfight is not against another plane. It is against the odds, against the elements, and against your own body. On December 14th, 1943, a B-26 Marauder medium bomber co-pilot named Sergeant John Johnny Quinlan found himself in the middle of a nightmare. His plane, the Hell's Angel, was on a bombing run over northern Italy. The plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire. The pilot was killed instantly. The plane's nose was shattered, and a freezing wind ripped through the cockpit. Quinlan was wounded by shrapnel. The plane went into a steep spinning dive. From the back of the plane, the bombardier, Lieutenant James Red Bone, crawled forward through the wreckage. He found Quinlan struggling to control the diving bomber. The controls were damaged. The plane was falling out of the sky. What followed was not a fight against an enemy fighter, but a desperate fight for control. Bone, a bombardier with only basic pilot training, and Quinlan, a wounded co-pilot, had to work together to save the plane. The bomber was in a death spiral. They had to somehow break the spin. They threw their combined weight against the controls. The plane groaned and shuddered. Slowly, agonizingly, they managed to pull it out of the dive, just a few thousand feet above the ground. Now they were flying straight, but they were deep in enemy territory. The plane was barely controllable. They had to get it home. They flew for over an hour, fighting the damaged controls every second. They navigated by dead reckoning, hoping they were heading in the right direction. They had to fly through the mountains, a terrifying prospect in a damaged plane. As they approached their home base in Sardinia, their problems got worse. The landing gear would not come down. They had to land the plane on its belly. An emergency crew on the ground laid a path of foam on the runway. Bone and Quinlan brought the battered bomber in. It skidded down the runway in a shower of sparks and came to a stop. They and the rest of the surviving crew had made it. This story, detailed in historical accounts of the 320th Bombardment Group, is a different kind of legend. There were no enemy planes shot down. There were no victories in the traditional sense. The victory was survival itself. It was a testament to the courage and teamwork of a bomber crew pushed to the absolute limit. It was a dogfight against gravity, fear, and mechanical failure. The stories of bomber crews are often overlooked in favor of the more glamorous tales of fighter aces. But their war was just as dangerous, if not more so. They flew into heavily defended skies facing flak and fighters with no way to escape. The story of the Hell's Angel is a reminder that some of the greatest battles of the air war were fought not for kills, but for life itself. How many similar stories of incredible airmanship and survival from bomber crews have been lost to history, overshadowed by the more easily quantifiable statistics of fighter combat? What kind of undocumented, on-the-fly repairs and improvisations did crews have to perform to bring their crippled planes home? And what was the long-term psychological impact on the men who had to endure hours of terror, knowing that a single mechanical failure could mean the end?